I want you to imagine, just for a second, a landmass so unfathomably vast that it covers a full sixth of the entire globe.
Yeah, it's almost hard to wrap your head around that scale.
Right. I mean, if you were to take a train across it at the turn of the 20th century, you would literally pass through 11 different time zones.
11 time zones on a single train ride. Just wild.
It's totally wild. And as you're looking out the window, you're looking at a fundamentally archaic world. You've got this place where absolute monarchs are ruling by divine, right, from these glittering gilded palaces in the capital. Well, tens of millions of impoverished peasants are living on these freezing, isolated villages.
Villages that are basically operating exactly like they did in the Middle Ages.
Exactly. So I want you to put yourself in the shoes of someone living there. Imagine that entire world, this society that had been stuck in this hierarchical stasis for centuries, just completely disintegrating right in front of your eyes.
Burning to the absolute ground.
Burning to the ground, yeah. Only to be rebuilt into a totally new, unprecedented, and frankly terrifyingly pervasive system. And imagine witnessing all of this agonizing transformation in the span of just a single generation.
It is truly staggering when you frame it that way. I mean, we are looking at a tectonic sociological shift here.
Oh, for sure.
One that didn't just alter the borders of a single country, but it fundamentally defined the geopolitical and ideological landscape of the entire 20th century. The sheer speed of that collapse and reinvention it's what makes it so compelling.
Which brings us perfectly to our mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring the really intricate, often brutal mechanics of this exact transition through Orlando Fidge's sweeping historical masterpiece, A People's Tragedy.
Such an incredible book.
It really is. Our goal today is to track the life cycle of the Russian Revolution, tracing its roots from the deep crisis of the old regime in 1891, all the way to the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, and of course the consolidation of the Soviet state.
And the challenge with the Russian Revolution is that it is incredibly easy to get completely lost in a sea of shifting dates and obscure acronyms.
Oh my gosh, so many acronyms.
Right, and a dizzying array of splintering political factions. The human element just often gets totally buried under the weight of Marxist theory and military maneuvers.
Yeah, it turns into a textbook real fast if you're not careful.
Exactly. So to keep us grounded in the actual lived experience of this history, we are going to anchor our discussion today to the personal journeys of three very specific, profoundly different individuals who actually lived through this storm.
I love this approach. So we'll be looking through the eyes of a reformist aristocrat, Prince Georgy Lvov. You've also got a brilliant military tactician, General Alexei Brusilov. And finally, a radical, fiercely observant writer, Maxim Gorky.
Three completely different perspectives on the exact same events.
Totally. And through their specific traumas, their victories, and their ultimate tragedies, we are going to witness the collapse of the Romanov Empire and the brutal birth of the Soviet system.
And I think it's really important to add a quick note here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Looking at these sources, they cover some incredibly dark and polarized political extremes. I mean, from monarchist crackdowns to mass socialist terror.
Right. Heavy, heavy stuff.
Yeah. And our goal here isn't to judge the ideologies or, take a political side. We are simply going to dissect the raw mechanics of how a society collapses and reforms.
Exactly. We're relying impartially on the historical analysis provided by the author to just understand why these massive historical shifts occurred. We're not endorsing anyone's politics here.
Definitely not. So to understand how a massive imperial house collapses, you really first have to examine its foundation.
Or the lack of one. Right.
Exactly. The fatal lack of a foundation in late 19th century Russia under Tsar Nicholas II. You really have to get inside the mindset of the Tsar to understand the fragility of the entire apparatus.
Yeah, because his mindset was so bizarre to modern eyes.
Yeah.
Nicholas II didn't view himself as, the chief executive of a modern nation state.
Not at all. He fundamentally believed in this concept of 17th century patrimonial autocracy.
Meaning he viewed the entirety of Russia, all its land, all its resources, all its people, literally as his own personal private estate.
Right. In his mind, he was the proprietor. The nobility were simply his estate administrators, and the peasants were just the workers.
Which is a wild way to try and run a country in the 1900s.
It's completely delusional. He was trying to steer this massive, rapidly industrializing empire in a 20th century global economy using a psychological framework that basically belonged in the Middle Ages.
And he actually distrusted his own government bureaucracy, didn't he?
He really did. Nicholas saw modern ministers and civil servants as this annoying bureaucratic wall that rudely separated him from the mystical divine bond he supposedly shared with his people.
This mystical bond that totally did not exist, which leads to one of the most fascinating misconceptions about Tsarist Russia that the book completely dismantles.
Oh, the police state myth?
Yes. When you think of the Russian Tsar, you tend to picture this all-powerful, omnipresent, suffocating police state. But the reality on the ground was shockingly different.
It's one of the biggest surprises. The Tsarist state was incredibly weak and severely undergoverned.
The math on it is just crazy.
It is mind-boggling. For every 1,000 inhabitants of the Russian Empire, there were only 4 state officials.
4 out of 1,000.
Yeah. I mean, if you compare that to modern European nations at the time, like France or Germany, they had exponentially more state presence. The effective daily power of the imperial government basically just stopped at the provincial capitals.
It's like building a massive skyscraper on a foundation of loose gravel. You can make the top floor of St. Petersburg as modern and gilded and opulent as you want. But if the state's actual power completely evaporates 50 miles outside the city limits, the whole structure is going to sink the moment there's a tremor.
That's a great analogy. Out in the countryside, where, 85% of the population actually lived, there was practically no state presence at all.
So who was running things out there?
Well, the vast majority of Russians were peasants living in these isolated, self-governing village communes called the Mir. And we really need to unpack how the Mir actually functioned, because it is crucial to everything that happens later.
Yeah, let's get into the Mir.
So in the absence of state officials, the peasants essentially governed themselves through these communes. The Mir controlled the land, distributing strips of it to families based on their size and need.
It was very communal, very local.
Very local. They had their own customary courts, their own village elders. The Tsar's bureaucrats back in St. Petersburg knew about as much concerning the daily mechanics of the Russian countryside as they knew about the interior of Central Africa.
Which is to say, nothing.
Basically nothing. You essentially had 2 Russias operating on the exact same landmass.
Right, 2 Russias. I love that framing. You have the westernized, French-speaking elite in the urban centers reading European literature, going to the ballet, and then you had tens of millions of illiterate, impoverished peasants living in a communal, agrarian reality that hadn't fundamentally changed since the 1500s.
And the chasm between those 2 Russias is perfectly embodied by our first 2 historical guides. Let's introduce Prince Georgy Lvov.
Yes, Prince Lvov. He was born in 1861, which is a highly symbolic year, right?
Very symbolic, because that is the exact year the Tsar finally emancipated the Russian serfs.
Okay, so tell us about Lvov, because he's not your typical snooty aristocrat.
Not at all. I mean, Prince Lvov was blue blood royalty in the truest sense. He traced his aristocratic lineage back 31 generations directly to Rurik, the 9th century Viking founder of the original Russian state.
You can't get more Russian royalty than that.
You really can't. But, and this is the kicker, by the time Lvov came of age in the late 19th century, his family was completely bankrupt, totally broke. They are a textbook representation of the declining, indebted Russian gentry following the end of serfdom. They have the titles, but no cash.
But what makes Lvov so compelling is that he didn't just, retreat to some crumbling parlor to mourn his lost wealth. He was fiercely practical.
Yeah, he rolled up his sleeves.
Literally. He and his brothers moved out to their dilapidated family estate in the province of Tula, this place called Popovka, and they literally worked the land themselves.
Which was unheard of for a prince.
Exactly. They lived like the peasants around them, ate rye bread and cabbage soup, planted orchards, and through just sheer grit, they eventually turned the estate into a highly profitable commercial farm.
And that intimate practical experience in the dirt, it shaped his entire political and social worldview. Lvov became what was known in Russia as a zemstvo man.
Okay, explain the zemstvo for us.
The zemstvos were local government councils set up during the reforms of the 1860s to handle local infrastructure. Because the central state was so absent, the zemstvos were basically the only bodies actually doing anything for the countryside.
So Lvov gets involved in this local council.
Yeah, he threw himself into this work. He believed in practical local reform, building primary schools, paving roads, setting up rural agronomy clinics.
Very hands-on, community-level stuff.
Exactly. He developed this deep, almost Tolstoyan belief that the massive cultural gap between the wealthy elite and the impoverished peasants could be bridged. Not through abstract political theory from some cafe in the city, but through practical work, shared labor, and mutual respect.
It's a beautiful idea. And hold that optimistic, noble image of the countryside in your mind for you listening. Let's contrast it with our second figure, Maxim Gorky.
Yeah, Gorky's a whole different story.
Or, as he was named at birth, Alexei Peshkov. If Lvov represents the hope of bridging the two Russias, Gorky's childhood is a brutal, unfiltered tour of the horrifying reality of the other Russia.
Oh, absolutely. Gorky's early life is the antithesis of the aristocratic parlor. He was orphaned super early and grew up in the teeming industrial slums of Nizhny Novgorod on the Volga River.
Which is a rough place.
Extremely rough. By the time he was 9 years old, he was living on the streets, scavenging for rags, bones, and nails to sell just to survive.
9 years old? That breaks my heart.
It's awful. He lived in an underworld of staggering poverty, devastating cholera epidemics, and just this culture of casual, horrific violence.
Yeah, the violence is key here. There's a specific, searing event from the sources that happens when he's 23 years old.
Oh, the whipping incident.
Yes, he's walking through a village and comes across a mob of peasants publicly horsewhipping a woman who had allegedly been unfaithful. He tries to intervene to stop this barbaric punishment, and the peasants just completely turn on him.
Yeah, they didn't appreciate the interference.
Not at all. They beat him so savagely he is left unconscious in the mud, nearly dead.
And we have to linger on that moment because it completely forged Gorky's political philosophy. It sets him apart from almost every other socialist intellectual of his era.
How so?
Well, Gorky became a radical Marxist, yes. But unlike the wealthy, university-educated socialists sitting in St. Petersburg cafes who romanticized the noble, pure peasant as the savior of Russia, Gorky actually knew the dark truth of the village.
Because he had literally been beaten by them.
Exactly. He saw the harsh, cruel reality of poverty and believed that the Russian peasantry was fundamentally backward, steeped in ignorance and savagery.
So he didn't see them as the heroes of the revolution.
No, he believed that true revolution, true civilization, had to come from the educated urban working class, the proletariat. They were the ones who could drag Russia out of its medieval darkness.
That makes total sense given his background. Okay, so rounding out our trio, we have a man who represents the sharp end of the Tsarist spear, General Alexei Brusilov.
Oh, Brusilov, the classic military man.
He's the quintessential aristocratic cavalry officer, educated in the elite corps des pages, impeccably dressed, highly distinguished. But beneath the brass buttons, he's growing deeply dismayed by what he is witnessing inside the Tsarist military machine.
And you can't blame him. Brusilov was a fierce Russian patriot, but above all, he was a competent military professional.
Which was surprisingly rare at the top.
Very rare. As the 20th century dawned, he was watching the military apparatus being run into the ground by the Tsar's incompetent aristocratic cronies. The high command in St. Petersburg preferred courtly manners, elegant parade uniforms, and nepotism over, actual modern military strategy or logistical planning.
So he's just incredibly frustrated.
Beyond frustrated. Brusilov represents the intense frustration of the capable, forward-thinking professionals in Russia who are trapped in this fossilized, archaic system that just flat out refused to modernize.
So we have these three guys and this crumbling, barely there state. I'm honestly struggling to understand the mechanics of this survival.
What do you mean?
Well, if you have a state that is completely hollowed out, where the bureaucracy stops at the city limits, and you have a massive, impoverished, occasionally very violent peasantry living in a totally separate cultural reality, how on earth did the Tsar maintain control for so long?
Ah, right. They maintained control through a really vital concept the Russians called proizvol, which translates roughly to arbitrary power or absolute fiat.
Arbitrary power, okay.
Because there was no functioning legal system in the countryside, no impartial judges, no concept of civil rights, the state relied entirely on the threat of extreme arbitrary violence.
So rule by fear.
100% rule by fear. To extract taxes or quell unrest, the regime used the provincial police, the fearsome Cossack cavalry riding into villages with whips, and the patriarchal, unchecked authority of the local nobility to terrorize the peasants into submission. It was quite literally governance by the whip.
But logically, governing by the whip doesn't build a stable society. It just creates a psychological time bomb.
Precisely. And this is perhaps the most important insight to grasp about the Russian mindset of the time. This system of arbitrary terror bred a peasantry that had absolutely no concept of civic duty, constitutional law, or legal rights.
Why would they? They'd never seen it.
Exactly. So to the Russian peasant, the concept of freedom, which they called volia, did not mean like participating in a democratic parliament or exercising free speech.
What did it mean to them?
Volia meant the complete and total absence of all authority. It meant the freedom to burn the landlord's manor, to seize the land, and to exact violent physical retribution against their former masters.
Wow. So it wasn't about building a new system. It was about destroying the old one.
Completely. The Tsarist state was just a fragile net of arbitrary force holding down a boiling cauldron of long-suppressed vengeance.
But a system relying on the threat of the whip to keep 100 million people in line is fundamentally brittle. And the event that finally exposes that brittleness doesn't come from a radical printing press or a terrorist bomb. It comes from the sky.
The weather.
The weather. The year is 1891, and catastrophic weather conditions trigger massive crop failures across the vast Volga region.
And this 1891 famine is really the crucible where the modern Russian revolutionary movement is actually forged.
Walk us through what happened.
Well, the weather was devastating. A freezing winter with no snow cover to protect the seeds, followed by a totally scorching summer. But the real tragedy was the Tsarist bureaucracy's complete and utter failure to respond.
They just couldn't handle it.
They floundered. They were too slow to ban grain exports, too clumsy to distribute relief. And at local levels, officials actively tried to suppress news of the famine to avoid looking bad to St. Petersburg.
Oh, so classic bureaucratic cover-ups while people are dying.
Exactly. You had desperate peasants literally stripping the thatch from their own roofs to feed their livestock and then eating weeds and bark themselves.
Oh my God.
And as a direct result of this state paralysis, 500,000 people died from starvation and the subsequent epidemics of cholera and typhus.
500,000 people. That is just a staggering failure of governance. And this is exactly where Russian civil society finally steps into the void, right?
Yeah, because the government failed so spectacularly, the educated public realized they had to organize their own relief if millions more weren't going to die.
And the man who steps to the forefront of this mobilization is our guy, Prince Lvov.
Yes. Prince Lvov utilized those Zemstvo networks we talked about to organize massive, highly efficient relief efforts. He set up soup kitchens, deployed doctors, organized supply lines.
He actually got things done.
He did. And the sociological impact of this was profound. This crisis mobilized Russian civil society, the doctors, the teachers, the progressive nobles, the students. It brought them together in a unified cause.
And it politicized them.
It fundamentally politicized them. They looked at the Tsar's rotting bureaucracy and realized, wait, we can govern ourselves way better than the autocracy can. The famine totally broke the illusion of the Tsar's paternal omnipotence and set the educated public on a direct, unavoidable collision course with the regime.
And that collision happens violently just a few years later in 1905, during an event forever known as Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday is the psychological turning point of the nation. The myth of the good Tsar, this deeply held peasant belief that the Tsar loved his people and was just being misled by evil advisors, that myth shatters forever on the snow of St. Petersburg.
Paint the picture for us. What actually happened?
So a peaceful crowd of tens of thousands of workers and their families marched toward the Winter Palace. They weren't armed revolutionaries. They were carrying religious icons, singing hymns, and holding portraits of Nicholas II.
They thought he would help them.
Right. They simply wanted to present a petition for better working conditions and a living wage.
And the Tsarist troops, panicking at the size of the crowd, just opened fire directly into the masses, killing and wounding hundreds of unarmed men, women, and children.
It was an absolute slaughter.
And our writer, Maxim Gorky, was actually in the city that day, wasn't he?
He was. He witnessed the massacre firsthand. He saw the blood pooling on the snow, the discarded portraits of the Tsar trampled underfoot.
That must have been profoundly radicalizing for him.
It was. He went back to his apartment that night and wrote a furious letter stating, "The Russian Revolution has begun. Only blood can change the color of history." The psychological bond between the ruler and the ruled was permanently severed.
Wow.
Yeah. And Fee just notes this really chilling detail in the book. An old man in the fleeing crowd was heard telling a young boy, "Remember, son, and swear to repay the Tsar."
Swear to repay the Tsar, that gives me chills.
It's pure vengeance.
So the resulting nationwide outrage, the strikes, the mutinies, it all forces Nicholas II to actually issue the October Manifesto. He reluctantly grants Russia its first ever parliament, the Duma, and promises basic civil liberties.
Reluctantly is the key word there.
Yeah, because almost the second the ink is dry, he tries to claw back those democratic concessions.
He genuinely believed that sharing power with the parliament was a betrayal of his divine oath to God. He used emergency decrees to bypass the Duma, he dissolved it whenever it disagreed with him, and altered the electoral laws to ensure only the conservative wealthy had a real voice.
So he's just playing games with them.
Completely. And by actively refusing to work with the moderate liberals, the very people who actually wanted to save his empire through reform, he virtually guaranteed that the opposition would eventually turn away from parliamentary politics and embrace violent radicalism.
It's like he's digging his own grave. So the elites won't reform, the peasants are alienated, and then the ultimate catalyst arrives. World War I, the great meat grinder.
World War I didn't just strain the Tsarist state, it completely broke its back. You have to remember, the Russian Imperial Army was overwhelmingly a peasant army.
Right. Millions of peasants sent to the front.
And the state simply lacked the industrial and logistical capacity to supply them in a modern, mechanized war. Men were sent to the front lines without rifles, literally told to pick up the weapons of their fallen comrades.
It's horrible.
There were chronic shortages of artillery shells, medical supplies, even basic winter boots. Millions of Russian soldiers were slaughtered.
And over 3 years, this immense suffering gradually transforms the army from a disciplined military force into an angry, armed, and starving revolutionary mob in uniform.
Exactly. Let's track our cast through this nightmare, actually. General Brusilov achieves one of the greatest military victories of the entire war for the Allies, the famous Brusilov Offensive of 1916.
He finally gets to show what he can do.
He does. Using brilliant, innovative shock troop tactics, he completely shatters the Austro-Hungarian lines. But his tactical genius is ultimately squandered.
Because of the high command.
Yes. The high command fails to support his breakthrough with reserves or supplies. Brusilov watches his men die for nothing, and he comes to the agonizing realization that the Tsar's leadership is actively destroying the country he has sworn to defend.
Meanwhile, Prince Lvov effectively becomes a one-man shadow government. Because the Tsarist logistics have totally collapsed, Lvov heads this massive organization called the Zemstvo Union, or Zemgor.
Stepping up again, just like in the famine.
Exactly. They are the ones actually organizing the field hospitals, manufacturing the munitions, and sending supply trains to the front. Lvov becomes a massive national hero because he is doing the job the Tsar is incapable of doing.
And Gorky becomes a prominent international voice against the senseless slaughter of the war, though he remains fiercely independent.
Right, he doesn't just fall in line with the other socialists.
No, he is constantly quarreling with rigid, exiled Marxist dogmatists like Lenin. Gorky favored a humanist approach to socialism. He wanted to elevate human dignity, culture, and education. Lenin, on the other hand, viewed people largely as instruments for brutal class war.
I have to pause here because this raises a massive what-if for me. We know the Tsar actually survives the 1905 revolution. In the years between 1905 and World War I, he has highly capable men, like his Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, who try to pass sweeping agrarian reforms.
Yes, Stolypin's wager on the strong.
Right. Stolypin wanted to break up the communes and create a stable, conservative, property-owning middle class of peasants who would theoretically support the state. So why doesn't that work? Could this entire tragedy have been avoided right there?
The tragedy of the missed off-ramp. It's a profound historical question. Figes argues that the regime was fundamentally irreformable, but not because the societal problems were unsolvable.
Then why?
It was irreformable because the Tsar, his court, and the conservative nobility viewed Western constitutionalism and peasant land ownership as a direct threat to their own existence and identity.
So they sabotaged it themselves.
They actively sabotaged their own reformers. Stolypin was constantly undermined. His legislation was blocked by the conservative elite until he was ultimately assassinated. World War I didn't create the crisis out of thin air. It just massively accelerated a collapse that the Tsar's own obstinacy had already made inevitable.
They were essentially barricading the doors of a burning building from the inside.
That's exactly what they were doing.
So the pressure cooker is whistling, and by the brutal freezing winter of 1916, it finally explodes. And it doesn't happen in a grand political assembly or a smoky rebel hideout. It happens in the breadlines of Petrograd.
Which brings us to the February Revolution of 1917.
Hmm.
And we need to completely dispel a massive historical myth here.
Yes, let's talk about that, because this blew my mind.
History often paints the February Revolution as this glorious, spontaneous, bloodless democratic awakening where the people peacefully locked arms and overthrew the tyrant.
But it was nothing of the sort.
It was a violent, chaotic, and terrifying street uprising. It started with women mothers who had been standing in freezing temperatures for 12 hours a day waiting for bread that just wasn't coming. They began smashing bakery windows.
And then the workers join in.
They were joined by striking industrial workers. But the critical tipping point came when the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, many of them young peasants themselves, refused to fire on the crowds.
Yeah.
Instead, they mutinied, turning their rifles on their own officers.
That moment, the soldiers turning on the state, is the actual death knell of the Romanov dynasty. But the violence that follows isn't democratic idealism, it's vengeance.
Absolutely. The violence was visceral and horrific. Tsarist symbols were ripped from buildings, police officers were hunted down and beaten to death in the streets, and naval officers in bases like Kronstadt were gruesomely tortured and murdered by their own sailors.
So this is that peasant volia we talked about earlier.
Yes. What you were witnessing on the streets of Petrograd was that long-suppressed peasant volia, that desire for absolute freedom from authority and violent retribution, finally erupting to the surface.
So in the vacuum of this collapse, the Tsar abdicates on a train sighting, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government is hastily formed to run the country. And who is chosen to lead this new democratic Russia as prime minister? Our reformist aristocrat Prince Lvov.
Prince Lvov.
Yeah, because he inherits an absolute bizarre and paralyzed system of governance known as dual power.
You really have to understand the mechanics of dual power to understand why the democracy failed. You had the provisional government made up of liberals and moderate socialists like Lvov operating out of one wing of the Tauride palace.
Okay, so they're the official government.
They had the formal titles, the international recognition, the ministries, but they had almost no real physical power on the streets. Operating out of the other wing of the exact same building was the Petrograd Soviet, this massive, chaotic council of workers and soldiers' deputies.
And they had the real power.
The Soviet had the actual physical power. They controlled the telegraph offices, the railway workers, and most importantly, the loyalty of the troops. But the Soviet refused to take formal responsibility for governing.
So Lvov has the steering wheel, but the Soviet controls the engine and the brakes. It's a recipe for total administrative paralysis. And Prince Lvov, bless his noble heart, is tragically unsuited for the ruthless reality of this moment.
Lvov suffered from what you might call fatal optimism. Remember his deep Tolstoyan belief in the inherent goodness and wisdom of the Russian people.
Yeah, from his farming days.
He genuinely believed that since the evil Tsar was gone, the people would naturally, organically embrace peaceful, Western-style democracy. Because of this belief, he absolutely refused to use state force to restore order.
Even when things got totally out of hand.
Even when mobs of peasants were burning down aristocratic estates across the country and soldiers were deserting the front lines en masse. He believed you couldn't use coercion against the people because that would just be returning to Tsarist methods.
And the psychological toll of watching his country dissolve while refusing to act is devastating. The sources note that the stress of it literally turned Lvov's hair completely white in a matter of months.
He just couldn't cope with the reality of it.
No. He eventually resigns in despair after the July Days, which was an abortive armed uprising in the capital, realizing that his gentle, democratic ideals simply cannot govern a country that is demanding violent, immediate retribution.
And Brusilov suffers a parallel humiliation in the military sphere during this time. After the Tsar abdicates, Brusilov is briefly appointed commander-in-chief of the entire Russian army by Alexander Kerensky, the vain, theatrical politician who eventually succeeds Lvov as prime minister.
But Brusilov doesn't last long, right?
No, Brusilov, a military man through and through, is quickly dismissed because he refuses to play Kerensky's political games. He has to watch in absolute despair as all army discipline totally disintegrates.
Because of the Soviets.
Yes. Following orders from the Soviet, soldiers form their own committees, abolish saluting, and literally hold votes on whether or not to obey orders to attack the enemy. The army simply melts away.
I just can't imagine a military functioning where they vote on whether to fight. That's insane. And what about Gorky? He finally gets the great revolution he's been writing about, predicting and agitating for his entire adult life. He must be thrilled, right?
You'd think so, but Gorky is absolutely horrified. Yes. His reaction is deeply telling because it connects directly back to that moment he was beaten in the village. He looks at the mob violence in the streets, and he doesn't see a noble socialist awakening. He sees a pogrom of greed, hatred, and vengeance.
Wow.
He saw the dark, uncultured, barbaric instincts of the oppressed peasant erupting exactly as he feared they would. He wrote scathing articles stating that the revolution was not elevating the human spirit, it was giving birth to real barbarians.
See, I'm really struggling to understand the mindset of the leaders here. Put yourself in Lvov's or Kerensky's shoes. They were sitting in Petrograd watching estates burn, watching the army dissolve, watching the economy crater. They have formal authority. Why don't they just read the writing on the wall, pull Russia out of World War I, and formally legalize the land grabs the peasants are already doing?
That seems like the logical move.
Right. If they'd just given the streets what they wanted, could they have stolen Lenin's thunder and stopped the Bolsheviks? Why choose paralysis?
That is the crucial question of 1917, and Figes answers it by identifying what he calls the constitutional illusion.
The constitutional illusion. Explain that.
So, the democratic leaders of 1917, like Lvov and Kerensky, were highly educated lawyers and intellectuals. They were obsessed with doing things the Western legal way. They believed that as a provisional government, they had no legal mandate to make massive permanent decisions like ending a war or distributing millions of acres of land.
Oh, I see.
They believed they had to wait for a fully democratic, nationwide constituent assembly to be elected and convened to pass these laws properly. They were just totally paralyzed by parliamentary procedure.
While the country is literally burning down around them.
Exactly. But the peasants in the villages and the workers in the factories didn't understand and frankly didn't care about abstract constitutional law. They understood direct action. They wanted the landlord's estate now. They wanted the senseless war to end now.
They weren't going to wait for a committee to draft a bill.
No. And this massive gap between the legalistic delays of the government and the immediate visceral demands of the streets is exactly the space that Vladimir Lenin exploited.
Lenin returns to Russia from exile in Switzerland, famously stepping off a sealed train at the Finland station in Petrograd, and he immediately smells blood in the water.
Lenin was a political genius of timing and ruthlessness. He understood immediately that the provisional government was paralyzed by its own legalism. He didn't offer the crowds complex constitutional arguments or timelines for elections.
He kept it simple?
Very simple. He offered a brilliant, simple three-word slogan: peace, land, bread. He promised immediate, radical action. He validated their desire to seize the land and end the war without waiting for lawyers to draft a constitution.
Which culminates in the events of October 1917. But, just like with February, we have to bust another massive historical myth. When we think of the October Revolution, we picture the dramatic scenes from Soviet propaganda movies. Thousands of armed workers storming at the gates of the Winter Palace in a massive, overwhelming wave of popular will.
Yeah, Eisenstein's movies really cemented that image. But the reality of the October coup was entirely different. It was not a mass popular uprising. It was a small-scale, highly organized, almost surgical military operation executed by a few thousand Bolshevik loyalists and Red Guards.
So it wasn't a massive mob.
Not at all. They didn't storm the city. They quietly seized the strategic choke points, the telegraph offices, the bridges, the railway stations, the electricity plants. They essentially walked into the massive political vacuum left by the total collapse of the provisional government's authority.
Just slipping in through the back door.
Pretty much. The takeover was so quiet and efficient that most regular people in Petrograd didn't even know a revolution had happened until they woke up the next morning and saw the posters on the walls.
That is wild. But Lenin's coup didn't end the revolution. Taking power in Petrograd is one thing. Controlling the massive Russian Empire is another entirely. The Bolshevik seizure of power just pours gasoline on a fractured society. Which takes us into the brutal final phase, the Civil War and the forging of the new Soviet autocracy.
And here we encounter one of the most chilling insights in Fiz's analysis. The descent into the horrific violence of the Russian Civil War wasn't an accidental byproduct of the revolution. It was a deliberate, calculated political strategy by Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership. Lenin actually wanted a civil war.
Wait, really? Why on earth would a leader taking control of a shattered country actively want a civil war?
Because Lenin knew his party was a minority. The Bolsheviks did not have the support of the majority of the Russian peasantry. A civil war does something very specific to a society. It polarizes it. It forces everyone to pick a side.
So no more middle ground.
Exactly. Lenin believed that the only way to consolidate Bolshevik power, completely destroy the old bourgeois and aristocratic classes, and justify extreme dictatorial measures was to plunge the country into a total life-or-death military struggle. War demands absolute obedience, and Lenin used the war to forge a dictatorship.
And the mechanics of that dictatorship are what we come to know as war communism and the Red Terror. To fight this civil war, the Bolsheviks implement measures that are staggeringly brutal.
Beyond brutal. To feed their Red Army and the starving cities, the Bolsheviks didn't buy grain from the peasants. They instituted forced requisitioning. Armed detachments were sent into the villages to seize the peasants' grain at gunpoint, leaving them with nothing, which predictably led to massive, horrific famines.
They just took everything.
Yes, and to crush political opposition, they created the Cheka, the secret police, which unleashed systematic mass terror against anyone deemed a class enemy: priests, former nobles, striking workers, or just people who looked too wealthy.
And they built a massive bureaucracy to run all this, right?
Oh, yeah. To manage this vast apparatus of war and terror, they built a massive, sprawling new bureaucracy. Within a few short years, this new Soviet bureaucracy ironically outnumbered the actual industrial workers they claimed to represent.
The irony is just dark. But the Bolsheviks weren't fighting ghosts. They were fighting the White Armies, a massive coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces led by former Tsarist generals, equipped and funded by foreign powers like Britain and France. Given the hatred of the Bolshevik grain seizures, why did the Whites ultimately fail to win the Civil War?
The Whites failed because they were fundamentally counter-revolutionary in the worst sense of the word. They were led by men who refused to accept that the world of 1914 was gone forever. Their fatal mistake was their refusal to recognize the peasants' land seizures.
They wanted to turn back the clock.
Exactly. When white armies captured territory from the Reds, they frequently brought the old aristocratic landlords back with them in their baggage trains. They treated the peasants with the exact same aristocratic disdain and arbitrary violence as the Tsar had.
So the peasants are trapped. They violently hate the Bolsheviks for stealing their grain, but they hate the Whites even more because the Whites want to steal their land and bring back the old masters.
Precisely. The peasants ultimately, grudgingly, tolerated the Reds as the lesser of two evils. The Reds took your food, but the Whites took your land and your dignity. Because of this political blindness, the Whites lost the Civil War politically in the villages long before they lost it militarily on the battlefield.
That makes so much sense. So let's follow the final, often heartbreaking trajectories of our three main figures as this new autocracy solidifies in the 1920s. Let's start with Prince Lvov, the gentle Democrat who refused to use violence. What happens to him?
Lvov's end is deeply tragic. After the Bolsheviks take power, he is arrested by the Cheka and faces execution. Miraculously, he manages to escape to the United States and eventually settles in Paris.
At least he got out.
True, but he spends his final years tirelessly traveling the world, writing letters, begging Western leaders to intervene and save Russia from the Bolsheviks, but he's largely ignored. He dies in Paris in 1925, a penniless, broken exile. His deep belief in a peaceful, democratic Russia was completely shattered by the reality of the violence.
And General Brusilov. His story involves an agonizing, almost impossible choice, doesn't it?
It is the ultimate tragedy of a patriot caught in a meat grinder. Brusilov's only son, Alexei, is taken prisoner by the Red Army. To protect his father from the Cheka, and perhaps to survive himself, Alexei agrees to command a Red cavalry unit. But then Alexei is captured by the White Army and executed.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Brusilov is driven by immense grief over his son's death, but he's also driven by a deep, ingrained sense of Russian nationalism. In 1920, when Poland invades Soviet Russia, Brusilov makes the staggering decision to join the Red Army simply to defend the Russian motherland from a foreign invader.
A Tsarist general, an aristocrat joining the Bolsheviks who destroyed his world. It's wild.
It was a pragmatic choice for national survival, but it ends in profound horror. Brusilov uses his immense personal prestige to offer a guarantee of amnesty to thousands of white officers who are surrounded in the Crimea. He promises them that if they surrender to the Reds, they will not be killed.
And they trusted him.
They did. Trusting his word, thousands surrender. And the Bolsheviks promptly massacre almost all of them. Brusilov dies in Moscow in 1926, completely tormented by guilt over the deaths of the men who trusted him.
That is just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And finally, Maxim Gorky, the man from the slums who championed the proletariat.
Gorky spends the brutal years of the Civil War using his massive personal influence with Lenin to try and mitigate the terror. He works tirelessly to save Russia's starving intellectuals, securing rations for people like the scientist Ivan Pavlov.
Trying to save the culture.
Exactly. But his spirit is finally shattered when the Bolsheviks arrest and execute his friend, the great poet Nikolai Gumilev, without a trial. Deeply disillusioned by the systemic terror, Gorky flees Soviet Russia in 1921.
But there's a very dark epilogue to his story.
Yes. Years later in the 1930s, lured by homesickness and Joseph Stalin's intense flattery, Gorky returns to the Soviet Union. He essentially becomes a captive Stalinist institution, living in luxury while writing propaganda that justifies the regime's forced labor camps. He dies in 1936 under highly suspicious circumstances, likely poisoned on Stalin's orders when he began to show signs of independence again.
So, synthesizing all of this,
Right.
what does this history actually mean? We started our story in the 1890s with a Tsar ruling by absolute fiat, backed by a vast secret police, using arbitrary violence to suppress an impoverished peasantry, and managing a massive bureaucracy.
Right.
And we ended the 1920s with a communist party ruling by absolute fiat, backed by a vast secret police using arbitrary violence to extract grain from an impoverished peasantry, and managing an even larger bureaucracy. Did anything actually change, or did they just repaint the walls of the prison?
That is the cruelest irony of the 20th century, and it speaks to the immense gravity of political culture. The Bolsheviks genuinely set out in their own ideological minds to liberate humanity from oppression.
But they didn't.
No, their isolation as a minority party, their rigid adherence to a dogmatic ideology, and the deeply brutalizing effect of fighting a vicious civil war forced them to adopt extreme military authoritarian methods to survive. The new Soviet bureaucracy simply inherited and expanded the exact autocratic culture of the Tsarist bureaucracy it replaced.
So the structure just survived the fire.
Exactly. The faces at the top changed, the slogans on the banners changed from God Save the Tsar to Workers of the World Unite, but the underlying autocratic structure remained totally intact, because fundamentally the underlying society and its political culture hadn't changed.
Which brings us to the core thesis of the book, and why Orlando Figes titled it A People's Tragedy.
The tragedy at the heart of this history is that the Russian people were active protagonists in their own downfall. Centuries of serfdom, poverty, and autocratic rule had completely prevented the development of a democratic civic culture.
They only knew the whip.
Right. They knew exactly how to tear down a tyrant, how to burn the manor house and smash the symbols of their oppression, but they didn't know how to build a republic of laws. When the Tsar's state collapsed, the people had the raw power to destroy the old world, but they critically lacked the political culture, the habits of compromise, legality, and civic trust required to build a free one.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Yes, that immense political vacuum made the rise of a new, even more pervasive dictatorship not just possible, but highly inevitable.
It is a profound and chilling lesson for us today about just how fragile democracy really is.
Okay.
You cannot just write a beautiful constitution or export a set of democratic laws and hand it to a society that has no cultural foundation for it. True liberty requires a deep culture of citizenship, of mutual trust, of active civic participation. It is not just about removing the tyrant at the top.
Exactly. The removal of oppression does not automatically equate to the creation of freedom. Building a free society requires decades, if not centuries, of hard generational work to build the civic institutions that sustain it.
Which leaves us with a provocative question for you to chew on long after this deep dive is over. If the agonizing failure of the Russian Revolution teaches us that you cannot build a free society on a foundation of historical oppression and an authoritarian culture, where else in our modern world are we repeating the tragic mistake of Prince Lvov? Where else are we assuming that just toppling a dictator will magically result in a flourishing democracy without doing the hard generational work of teaching a society how to be free?
It's a vital question to consider.
Think about that the next time you hear about an empire disintegrating. Until next time.